I've had the privilege of travelling to Israel a number of times, and spending time walking the lands of the Bible has really helped me appreciate how much the scriptures are grounded in the everyday realities of lives and communities and bodies. One of the most fascinating things about visiting Israel today is seeing some of the ancient practices of the Old Testament scriptures applied and lived out in a very modern culture, including, of course, the practice of Sabbath. Staying in a hotel in Israel on a Friday night brings with it some fascinating challenges. You might get asked as you check in whether you would prefer an old school brass key or an electronic swipe card, which for an outsider raises a bit of an existential dilemma as to which of the two is considered more work. If you're staying in a high rise, you'll want to make sure you understand what a Shabbat elevator is. Because if you don't, you'll realise soon enough when you get in and the buttons don't work to save you from having to do any work in pushing them, but instead you stop at every single floor on the way up and on the way back down. Now, without wanting to be judgmental, these kinds of technical rules to ensure that one doesn't accidentally do something that could be considered work and so therefore break the Sabbath do feel a little legalistic. Perhaps even a little bit like the kinds of things the Pharisees in Jesus' day were arguing about, and why Jesus had to remind them that the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the needs of the Sabbath. Is Sabbath really about vigilantly measuring the amount of effort something takes to do and then deciding whether that is allowed or not on the day of rest? Well, Jesus says it was never meant to be that kind of a burden. Now, at the same time, I've had some experiences in Israel that have really opened my eyes to the beauty, the rich invitation and the true delight of what Sabbath can look like. The Jewish Sabbath always starts at sunset on Friday. And in Jerusalem, that is the most amazing time to be at the Western Wall. You're probably familiar with the Western Wall. It's the last remaining part of the Jewish temple that stood in Jesus' day. It's most commonly known as the Wailing Wall because most of the time it's the place where people go to mourn, to pray, to lament over the fact that the temple has been destroyed and they cannot worship there any longer, and to cry out for its restoration. But not at sunset on the Sabbath. As the Sabbath begins, huge crowds gather at the wall. Everyone from the strict Orthodox wearing their fancy shiny black coats and their big fuzzy hats, to the soldiers in their army fatigues carrying their automatic weapons, and tourists and children and everyone in between. Thousands of people cram into every spare inch of space, or at least they did in pre-COVID times. And as the sun begins to set, a hush falls over the crowd. And then the Sabbath is welcomed in, and there is singing and dancing and cheering and clapping and shouting and praying. It's a whole other world. There are strangers welcoming one another, pulling them into circles to dance together. There is overlapping melodies heard because different groups are singing all kinds of different songs at the same time. There is laughter and hugging and twirling and smiling. It is an experience of pure, unadulterated delight. Now, I can't actually show you any photos or videos of that gathering itself because it is a space that is set apart, and so no cameras, no phones are allowed. All you can do is be present in the moment and just take it in, get caught up in the joy and the freedom and the delight. It truly is an experience like no other. You would be hard-pressed to find yourself in Jerusalem and forget about the fourth of the 10 Commandments. Remember to observe the Sabbath day. And then, an hour or two after, just as quickly as the celebration welcoming the Sabbath began, the crowds disperse. And there's this sense of hurry on the streets of the old city as people head back to their homes to share the Shabbat meal with their family and friends. And this too, for me, has been a bit of a revelation. This photo, which probably just looks like a photo taken from any ordinary dinner, was taken at the end of the first Shabbat meal that I had ever participated in Jerusalem. And the dinner went for hours. There were candles and wine, there were prayers and blessings, there was laughter and conversation and multiple courses of delicious food. But the memory that has stuck with me above all others when I look at that photo is something that happened before we'd even tasted a single bite. Our host brought out these little bowls filled with sweet smelling spices and fragrant fruits, things like cinnamon sticks and cloves, jasmine and apple. And they were passed around the table, but not to eat, simply to smell, to just take time to take in the aromas, to enjoy, to wonder, to delight. And so when I hear the words again of the prophet Isaiah to the people of God, enjoy the Sabbath, make it your delight, it's that table that my thoughts often go back to. A simple memory, a very simple practice, but one that speaks volumes about my own practices. Because if I'm honest, how often before I eat a meal do I pause? Really pause, purely to take in the fragrances and the aromas. Most of my meals are pretty much more rushed than that. Or how often do I pause when I'm walking to literally stop and smell the roses, to drink in their scent and delight in it? How often do I slow down and notice the art on the streets I drive down every day? Or listen to the call of the birdsong? Or savor the feel of the wind? Or actually look into the eyes of the person serving me behind a counter? I'm so pleased to be able to be here to be part of this teaching series you're doing on redeeming restfulness. And I know you've already been talking about the challenges of living in a culture which is so often hurried, busy, tired, restless, exhausted. The practice of Sabbath really is one that speaks so powerfully into our time. Last week, Dan spoke about some of the different ways the Hebrew word Shabbat is used in the Old Testament. There's the idea of stopping and ceasing, reminding ourselves that we are not God and embracing our human limits. Then there's the idea of resting, that 6-1 rhythm of evening and morning that invites us to be renewed in preparation for our work. And there's the idea of worship, a day that is set apart as holy to orient our whole beings back to God. And there's this idea of delight, taking time with God to enjoy and celebrate, to revel with Him in the goodness and beauty of all that He has made. And that's what I want to focus on together this morning. Sabbath as delight. Sabbath as delight is an invitation into the big story of God from beginning to end, from creation to new creation. In Genesis 1, God creates the heavens and the earth, and then He creates the Sabbath, this day on which He pauses to marvel at all that He has made, looking again at how good everything is, smiling upon it, enjoying His relationship with it. But even more than that, God then invites humanity, us who are part of His creation, to join Him in His delight at His creation. We too are offered this day, this practice to pause, to notice, to take it all in with gratitude, enjoyment, and delight. Sabbath as delight also lifts our eyes to the goal of creation, to the other end of God's story. And while the book of Revelation doesn't use the word Sabbath itself, the New Testament does draw on this idea and language of rest when it talks about the new creation. The picture of what the new creation looks like in the last 2 chapters of the Bible, Revelation 21 and 22, takes us to the garden city, where there is beauty and goodness, worship and presence, and the invitation to enjoy forever all that God has made. True delight forever and ever. And so as we live out of the creation story and we anticipate and live towards the new creation story and the renewal of all things, we find ourselves in between, where Jesus reminds us about this practice of Sabbath. This rhythm of taking time each week to pause, to wonder, to worship, to give thanks, and to delight. I want to take you this morning to Isaiah chapter 58. You might want to follow along, which is the introduction to the final section of this amazing prophetic book, a work which climaxes with an incredible vision of the renewal and recreation of all the things. That is, it's not that different to those last couple of chapters in the book of Revelation. But Isaiah too lives in the in-between. He lives in the real world, our world, where people forget or just don't get it at all, where there are distractions and pressures, and where sin gets in the way of God's people truly experiencing the delight of Sabbath. Isaiah starts this passage with a shout, but it's not a shout of joy. He calls the people of Israel to an awareness of their sins. They might be coming to God's temple every day. They might even look like they are keen to hear his word and follow his way. But it's actually all a pretense. It's a show. They are just going through the motions. We have fasted before you, they say. Why aren't you impressed? We've been very hard on ourselves and you don't even notice it. These spiritual practices that God has gifted them for their blessing, things like fasting and feasting, festivals and Sabbath, have become a chore. They are putting on a show to try and impress God. They want him to notice how hard they are working at it. What a burden it is on them to keep God's commands. They're a little bit like the Pharisees, counting their steps and measuring how far they're allowed to walk. Or perhaps even a little bit like the people using a showy brass key rather than an electronic swipe card, or making sure to be seen to be not pushing the buttons in the elevator. Look at this burden that I am willing to take on for you, God. Aren't you impressed with me? If we ever fall into thinking that practicing Sabbath is about putting on a good show for God or for our pastor or for our church family, then we are no different to the people Isaiah is calling out. You can't impress God by how seriously you practice the Sabbath or how beautiful your preparations look. The invitation is not to show what a good Christian you are because you do this better than anyone else. Isaiah's answer to the people of his day is swift and cutting. You're not doing this to please God, he says. You're doing it to please yourselves. And I know this, he says, because it's all surface level stuff. You might be refraining from food, but you're still ripping off your employees and taking pot shots at your enemies. You're just going through the motions because on the inside, there's no peace, there's no joy, there's no compassion. You have missed the point of God's commands. Because the purpose of all this is flourishing life for you and for all people. And so God says, no, this is the kind of fasting I want. Free those who are wrongly imprisoned. Lighten the burden of those who work for you. Let the oppressed go free and remove the chains that bind people. Share your food with the hungry and give shelter to the homeless. Give clothes to those who need them and do not hide from relatives who need your help. You see, the practices that God invites his people into, the spiritual rhythms of his way of life, bring freedom and justice, never pride or exploitation. They are not a burden for anyone, whether the people who are practicing them, but nor are they a burden for those around them to whom they are designed to overflow and bless. The kind of Sabbath that God is interested in is truly delight, not only for us as his people, but for all those we live among. What would it look like for us to practice Sabbath in ways that bring joy and freedom and light and life to those who are suffering and burdened in our community? Sabbath is not a private activity where we each go into our own homes and bunker down with our own family to rest by retreating from the world around us. Sabbath is to be practiced in the midst of the chaos, confusion, pain, and suffering of our world. These practices of stopping, resting, delighting, and worshipping are ones that we can share with our world by our example, by the blessings of them overflowing, and by inviting people to join us. Now, when we slow down and acknowledge our own need for rest and renewal, we model to those around us their own human limitations too. And perhaps we hope that we might lift the busy burden from their shoulders for a moment too. Or when we refuse to participate in the patterns of production and consumption for a day, as Walter Brueggemann says, treating people around us as fellow beings rather than those who can do something for us, we're inviting them into Sabbath, into delight. Or as Isaiah says, feed the hungry, help those in trouble. Then your light will shine out from the darkness, and the darkness around you will be as bright as noon. Practicing delight in God's good creation, including honouring and valuing our fellow humans and divine image bearers, no matter their status or station, is like the brightest light shining in the blackest darkness, Isaiah says. You know how Jesus tells his followers that we are the light of the world? Or how he says that our churches are like cities on a hill shining a light for all to see? What if one of the ways that works in practice is not by running lots of programs or doing lots of things or even speaking lots of words? What if it's by modelling a different way of being in the world? By inviting people to unhurriedness and restfulness. By offering to include them in a community where they are valued not based on what they do or produce or earn, but simply by the one who loves them. Sabbath is so countercultural. Perhaps it just might be the most radical way we can be a light into our contemporary, frenetic, distracted culture. We point forward to God's goal for the whole of creation, where he is ever present and all things are renewed. Isaiah goes on to say, "The Lord will guide you continually, giving you water when you are dry and restoring your strength. And you will be like a well-watered garden, like an ever-flowing spring. Some of you will rebuild the deserted ruins of your cities, and you'll be known as the rebuilders of walls and the restorers of homes." These are all pictures of beauty, goodness, restoration, delight. They take us back to the garden of God's good creation and its refreshing, sustaining rhythms of life, represented by the garden. And they point us forward to the renewal of all things, when the richness of human creativity and participation in this world is refined and redeemed, and where all that we have contributed and co-created with God in this world is truly able to be enjoyed and delighted in its beauty and goodness forever, represented here by the city. Just like Revelation, the garden city. It's this big vision of God for the whole of creation, the mission of redeeming and renewing all things for the flourishing of God's people in relationship with him through his Son. And it's a vision that we can participate in even now, as we tend God's good creation with him and as we seek his restoration in broken people's lives. We take time to truly delight in the wonder and beauty of all and each one that he has made. So how do we live out of and within and towards all of that? Well, this chapter of Isaiah ends with these powerful words. Keep the Sabbath day holy. Don't pursue your own interests on that day, but enjoy the Sabbath and speak of it with delight as the Lord's holy day. Honour the Sabbath in everything you do on that day. Don't follow your own desires or talk idly. Then the Lord will be your delight. I will give you great honour and satisfy you with the inheritance I promised to your ancestor Jacob, says the Lord. Sabbath as delight. It's not just a good idea or a helpful corrective to our culture or a commandment for life, even though it is each of those things. But here God says it is the way that we find true delight in him, and that we ensure the inheritance that he has always promised his people, the goal of creation and the purpose of the whole biblical story, might be our reality. Yes, one day, fully and forever, but even now, in the midst of chaos and mess in this world, we can find joy, satisfaction, and we can overcome. So what does Sabbath as delight look like for you? How can you practice this personally, as a family, and as a church community? One of the things I love about my own church community at Richmond is that we talk a lot about practices, meaning rhythms or habits that we have a go at that help us land what we talk about in our gatherings each week in specific and practical ways day by day. And so I was really excited when Dan told me that you've included this weekly habit or practice for each week of this Redeeming Restfulness series. And so I want to introduce you to this week's habit, which is one that really resonates for me and I hope will for many of you as well. It's a habit called Photo of the Day. So the invitation I want to leave with you is that you might commit this week to taking one photo each day of something that you find delight in. Something that captures your attention or makes you go, wow. This is about practicing delight. And we learn to practice delight often by slowing down and paying attention, by really looking, listening, and noticing. So a photo a day is an invitation to really see. It's not about going out of your way to find something special or unique so much as paying attention to the ordinary and everyday all around you and seeing God's hand in his good creation. It's an invitation to Sabbath with God by taking on his perspective, when he sits back and surveys all that he has made and says, it is very good. Isn't that an incredible picture of our God on that seventh day of creation, and a practice that he continues? I imagine God looking at the sun that he created and causes to rise every morning and seeing the colours it paints across the sky and saying, wow, look what I made. But I also imagine God looking at the person who is sleeping rough under that same sun, the person curled up in a tattered sleeping bag and passed by without a glance by early morning joggers. And I imagine God saying, wow, look at who I made. I imagine God observing again the riot of different hues in a flower garden or a spice shop and smiling to himself about the breadth of the colour palette that he created. I also imagine God observing at a street artist adorning the walls of the grey city with brightness and warmth, and smiling at the creativity the one that he made in his image shares with him. I imagine God glancing at a giraffe, the one that he designed, and chuckling at its awkward gait as he marvels again, how good are they? I also imagine God glancing at a child playing with his puppy, teaching it to fetch for the first time or rolling around on the ground for cuddles, and chuckling as he marvels again, how good are they? I imagine God paying attention to the different grains and roughage that he has provided as food for different animals and how each perfectly meets their needs, and whispering, very good. I also imagine God paying attention to the family gathered around a table laden with a feast to share with the hungry they have invited into their home to enjoy the meal with them, and whispering, very good. And I imagine God holding the breadth and the depth of the universe he created in his hands, planets and stars and galaxies dancing across his palm, and delighting in its incredible, vast breadth. And I imagine God holding the community of his people, his church, in his spirit as they extend their hands to those outside, welcoming them to drop their burdens and join in the dance of freedom, joy, and rest found in his Son Jesus, and delighting in his incredible, vast love. What will it be that captures your delight and invites you to share it with God and his people this week. You can find out more about the photo a day habit if you go to the hub online, or if will be posted in your Facebook group. There's even a hashtag to share your photos on social media or to print them out and put in the foyer so that others can see them. But the main point of this practice is that moment of noticing something that brings you delight and receiving that as God's good gift to you. Whether it's in nature or in community, in creativity or productivity even, whether it's in food or music or sport or play. God's Sabbath invitation to you is to join him in delighting in his good creation and know that as you do, he is delighting in you. Let me pray. Creator God, thank you that you made all things and you made all things good. You sit back on that first Sabbath and simply delight in all that you have made. It brings you joy and wonder. And you've invited us to join you there. We know that we live in the in-between time between the goodness of your original creation and the restoration of your new creation that we are waiting for. And there is suffering and pain and brokenness and confusion. There is burden and stress and exhaustion. But we thank you for your invitation to practice Sabbath with you and the ways that it restores and renews us and draws us back again into relationship with you. And so I pray this week as we seek together to practice Sabbath as delight, whether for one day or a moment each day, that you would open our eyes to see your beauty and your goodness in your creation around us, both in the natural world that you have made, in the lives of the people you have made in your image, and in the creativity of what your people produce that reflects your creativity and your goodness and your beauty. Help us to revel, to delight, to wonder, to marvel, so that we might with you practice again a way that invites us into the breadth of your story from beginning to end, and a way that overflows from us to a world around us who desperately needs to be invited into a different way of life, flourishing life, life restored and renewed, in a way that invites others to join us. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.